I also would like to welcome all of you, those who are here, Professor Jayaram, Professor Deshpande, Professor Aziz, and all my colleagues who are in this room as well as online, and Professor Indira and special friends, and Professor Kadant. We are very happy that you all found some time to attend this lecture, and then we are particularly pleased. And there will be, and also my colleagues, Dr. Channamma and then Jaina, okay, but they both of them are part of this function. And then before I request Dr. Channamma to speak a few words, introduce Professor Jayaram, I just would like to tell you about one thing. That is, Professor Jayaram was the former director, so our boss, including the Professor Deshpande, and then he was here, and then he has contributed a great deal to the institute, and then you may hear something called concept note. Very often we hear something called concept note. He is the author of that concept note, which we still use when it comes to when it comes to our center level meetings and various other things. Sometimes we appreciate concept note, sometimes we criticize, but I think that is your contribution. We value that contribution. And second thing that I always remember about Professor Jayaram is that his academic discipline, and he was editor of Sociological Bulletin for 1 decade, 15 years. Okay, sir. For 15 years, he single-handedly took care of the journal. So I used to meet him weekends whenever I visited his house on Saturday morning, and he would invariably sitting in front of his computer laptop, looking into the papers, responding to authors and everything. But he has really given his best to the journal for 15 years. And then you may wonder that what's so great, because journals are managed by several people, but he did not have even an assistant to help him and all those things. So he was alone managing. So it's a single person actually. And then I used to ask him that how exactly you are managing. And then he told that every Saturday I allocate for a journal. So whatever may be the thing, Saturday morning, and then he will sit the whole day and then clear all the pending work. That is a discipline that I think something which we all should learn. And then whatever commitments that he has made when he was in service or something like that, and then he has completed them. So even after retirement, the book projects he has completed. And then I'm happy to inform you that that his recent book, From Indians in Trinidad to Indo-Trinidadians, the making of Girmitia diaspora. This has just come out last week only. So that such is his academic discipline, because he has committed. So therefore he would like to deliver this book. And then I think this is something which we have learned, sir. So we are very happy that you have agreed to give this lecture, Understanding the Wounded Civilization. I think this is quite, many people have written back that this is very interesting title, interesting topic. And then we are all waiting to hear from you. And then with these few words, then I once again warmly welcome you. And then so we will now I'll request Dr. Channamma to introduce.
Thank you, sir. Well, I consider this as an honor for me to introduce Professor N. Jayaram. As we know that Professor Jayaram was born in Bangalore and he has done his education from Bangalore itself. He has done his BA in Economics, Political Science and Sociology from St. Joseph's College and PhD from Bangalore University Sociology Department. And he also has worked in Bangalore University from 1972 to 1999. He has taught sociology in Sociology Department. Apart from this, he has also worked in Goa University from 1999 to 2003, that is for 4 years. So for 27 years, he has served in Bangalore University and 4 years in Goa University. Along with this, he has taught research methodology at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai from 2003 to 2015. He has also been the director of our institute, Institute for Social and Economic Change, from 2006 to 2008. Well, he has also been a fellow at the Indian Institute of Advanced Study, Shimla, a visiting research mentor at Christ Deemed University, Bangalore, and visiting professor at the National Law School of India, University, Bangalore. He has also visited and lectured at various institutes and universities abroad. And during 1994 and 96, he was the visiting professor of Indian Studies at the University of West Indies, that is in Trinidad and Tobago. And incidentally, as we all know, that V.S. Naipaul also was born in Trinidad, and the lecture today also revolves again, around his work. So Professor Jayaram's field of specialization is sociology of education. Along with this, he has also research interest in other transdisciplinary areas like theory and methods, political sociology, urban studies, and sociology diaspora. He has also, to his credit, around 20 books where he has either written, edited, and adapted. Well, we have two of his co-authors here, Professor Deshpande and Professor Rajshekhar. To mention few of his books, uh, Higher Education and Status Retention, Housing in India, which was co-edited with R.S. Sandhu. Introductory Sociology, Sociology, Methods and Theories, Sociology of Education, Social Conflict, which was co-edited with Satish Sabharwal. The Indian Diaspora, Keywords, Identity, which was edited with Aziz Almazar, Wang Bin, David Hollinger, Mahmoud Mamdani, and Emmanuel Renault. On civil society issues and perspectives, social research methods, persistent issues and emergent trends. Dr. V.K.R. Rao, a passionate humanitarian, which was edited with S.L. Rao. Footprints of Development and Change, Essays in Memory of Professor V.K.R. Rao, which was co-edited with Professor Deshpande. And we have Cross-National Perspectives, which was co-edited with Fred Lazin and Matt Evans. Vulnerability and Globalization, Perspectives and Analysis from India, which was co-edited with Dr. Rajshekhar. So we have a list of his books. Along with this, he has authored over 180 papers and 300 book reviews. So with his academic endeavors, he has also been a member in various capacities in various national and international associations, like the Association of Third World Studies, International Network on the Role of Universities in Developing Areas, and Indian Sociological Society. He was the managing editor of Sociological Bulletin, that is the Journal of Indian Sociological Society, which Professor Rajshekhar just mentioned now. He has also been the editor of ICSSR Journal of Reviews and Abstract, Sociology and Social Anthropology, and so on. One thing that we also have to know is he has been the trustee of Samiksha Trust. We all know that it publishes EPW. So on the international arena, he is on the International Editorial Advisory Board of the Journal of Educational Planning and Administration, New Delhi, and he is the recipient of Dr. Padaru Guru Raja Bhatt Annual Award, and he has also been recognized by ET Now Education Leadership Award 2013 and Lifetime Achievement Award 2021 of the Indian Sociological Society. So we are quite eager to understand how you will unfurl the Nobel laureate works from the social science perspective. So we welcome you again, sir. So the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
So just before I said, we already have the paper by him. Okay, so paper is there, and then he has already given it to the Institute for publication. So he said that I have written whatever I wanted to write. So sir, we are very much eager to listen to you. Now over to you, sir. But only one lecture. Yes, sir. So get one. Sir.
I think this is good enough. One is good enough. Professor Rajshekhar, Professor Abdul Aziz, Professor Deshpande, esteemed colleagues, past and present, the non-academic staff, old and continuing. I see one old and continuing. Research scholars, ladies and gentlemen, both in the real world and in the virtual world. I see so many of them. Professor Karan, Professor Indra, Sobin George, etc. I am honored by the invitation to deliver a lecture as part of the Golden Jubilee celebrations of the Institute for Social and Economic Change, popularly known by its acronym ISEC, among social scientists in India and abroad. Personally, I am delighted to be delivering this lecture as I have been associated with ISEC in various capacities almost from its inception in 1972. I recall with pleasure my first seminar presentation in one of the fortnightly sociology seminars organized by the Department of Sociology, Bangalore University, under the stewardship of the late Professor C. Rajgopalan, in collaboration with the ISEC's sociology group, led by the late Professor M. N. Srinivas. I thank ISEC and particularly its director, Professor Rajshekar, for the honor of the invitation to deliver this lecture. Let me also take this opportunity to convey my felicitations to Professor Rajshekar and his colleagues and the non-teaching staff on reaching this landmark. My best wishes are always with them. The theme: celebrating the Golden Jubilee of ISEC, one cannot but remember the legend called V.K.R.V. Rao. Besides being a consummate economist, Rao was one of independent India's greatest institution builders. The three institutions that he founded and nurtured: Delhi School of Economics, founded in 1948, Institute of Economic Growth, Delhi, founded in 1957, and Institute for Social and Economic Change, founded in 1972, stand testimony to this. Laying the cornerstone for the ISEC building in Nagarbavi on 14th July 1974, Srimati Indira Gandhi, the then Prime Minister of India, acknowledged Rao's contributions as an institution builder thus: Dr. V.K.R.V. Rao's restlessness and dynamism have found expression in the building of numerous institutions. The country is indebted to him for the centers of study and research he has built in Delhi and now the region from which he hails, as the benefit of his vision, his experience, and his creative drive. If Rao conceptualized the Delhi School of Economics after the London School of Economics as a center of teaching and learning, he founded the Institute of Economic Growth to focus attention on India's developmental issues. In due course, it occurred to Rao that growth was a narrow concept, and the study of economic growth relegates to the background the broader process of social change. Thus, when it came to founding ISEC, Rao laid emphasis on change and adopted an explicitly interdisciplinary orientation. In naming the institute, he took care to mention social and economic and social before economic. Inspired by Rao's vision, at ISEC, succeeding generations of social scientists drawn from different disciplines have been painstakingly documenting the changes taking place in the economy, society, and polity in the country. They have covered a large variety of issues in a wide range of subjects. They have largely succeeded in providing us with well-documented and data-rich accounts of isolated issues or about socio-temporally delimited contexts. Based on painstakingly collected primary data, and our masterly analysis of secondary data, they have enriched our understanding of the developments at the ground level through though limited in space and time. Their studies are akin to exquisitely wrought miniature paintings. However, for capturing the salient changes over long periods of time, these studies are not of much help unless the findings on a single phenomenon are synthesized and then integrated with similar synthesis of findings about other phenomena. In India, very few social scientists have even attempted such synthesis. As a consequence, we often fall back upon the work of social historians. But social historians too generally delimit their scope either in terms of a region and or on a period, or focus on a particular aspect of a society or a social movement. In contrast to sociological miniature paintings, I have found in the work of sociologically imaginative literateurs nuanced landscape sketches of socio-political change. This is especially so when the literature is an outsider with insider sensibility, someone who has been acquainted with the society and culture of India and keenly observed their subtleties in the length and breadth of the country for over half a century. One such literature is Vidyadhar Suraj Prasad Naipaul, better known in the literary world as V.S. Naipaul and affectionately as Sir Vidya or just Naipaul. In his active literary career of nearly 50 years, Naipaul relentlessly processed the world, stirring through a distillate of people, places, ideas, and events, asking many of the vexed questions a turbulent century has often been afraid to ask itself. Naipaul's work includes 14 works of fiction, 15 works of non-fiction, and scores of essays. Naipaul has deservedly won many literary accolades. In 1990, he received a knighthood for services to literature, and in 2001, he was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature. Naipaul first came to India in 1962 at 29 years of age, and last in 2015 to attend the Jaipur Literature Festival. He visited and traveled in India many times in the intervening 53 years. Based on his astute observations, incisive interviews, a rich collection of anecdotes, and thick descriptive notes, he wrote 3 books and several essays on India or India-related themes. For the instant lecture, I have chosen to give a sociological reading of his Indian trilogy, An Area of Darkness, first published in 1964, India, A Wounded Civilization, first published in 1977, and India, A Million Mutinies Now, published in 1990. Collectively, 1,080 pages of text. The title of this lecture is adapted from the second book, India, A Wounded Civilization. This book was preceded by An Area of Darkness and followed by India, A Million Mutinies Now, separated by 13 years on each side. Expectedly, there are overlaps in the themes and issues they deal with. This lends continuity to Naipaul's chronicle. What is noteworthy is the change in Naipaul's method of analysis and his understanding of and concern for the society and culture of India. This will be the thrust of my lecture. I will try to tell you how his method of analysis changed from book to book and how his orientation to India changed from book to book. Those who read only the first one were disenchanted with it, who were critical of it, did not touch, the next 2 books, but they lost, very heavily, I would say. Those who read only the last one did not know how he had arrived at where he actually, landed. This has influenced my sociological reading of these 3 books and the choice of the themes and issues therefrom for this lecture. You can imagine reading 1080 pages. I have read it several times for different occasions. And preparing a lecture, however short it is or long it is, it's about 10,000 and odd words that I have finally written, which I am not going to present here. You can imagine we will not be able to cover everything. I have tried to focus on what I regard as sociologically, meaningful. Announcing the award of the Nobel Prize in Literature for 2001, the Swedish Academy described Naipaul as a literary circumnavigator, a modern philosopher carrying on the tradition that started originally with letters persanes by Montesquieu and Candide by Voltaire. In a vigilant style, which has been deservedly admired, he transforms rage into precision and allows events to speak with their own inherent irony. He was awarded the prize, Academy says, for having united perceptive narrative and incorruptible scrutiny in works that compel us to see the presence of suppressed histories. The Swedish Academy regarded Naipaul as Joseph Conrad's hair as the analyst of the destinies of empires in the moral sense, what they do to human beings. His authority as a narrator is grounded in his memory of what others have forgotten, the history of the vanquished. I hardly need to justify either the theme of my lecture or its protagonist. Of course, many people have asked me, have I given up, sociology? Now, after being in the profession for more than 50 years, I know the limitations of my subject rather too well. And I find in the remainder, of my life, I would like to spend on reading literature, because I find these are the people who have helped us understand our predicament much better than either sociologists or economists or economic historians. Before I turn to the substance of the lecture, however, some disclaimers and clarifications are in order. This lecture is not an exercise in literary criticism of Naipaul's Indian trilogy. I see one or two people who are from literature, including one of my students who teaches English literature. So this address, to her, this lecture is not an exercise in literary criticism of Naipaul's Indian trilogy. That is by now available aplenty. Rather, it is an attempt at gleaning sociological insights from Naipaul's astute observations and acerbic commentary on society, culture, and polity in India, and is a unique longitudinal interpretations thereof. He never mentions that he is a follower of Rodel, but if you read his books, you find you need not have to have a better illustration of the French school of historiography than Naipaul himself. That is, if you read all the three books, you see together. Such an attempt, I think, is necessary, given how easily our sensitivity as a nation is outraged by criticisms, while our sensibilities remain astonishingly unaffected. If somebody criticizes us, we get provoked very easily, but our sensibilities remain, untouched. To make a distinction between sensitivities and sensibility. So how sensitivity gets affected, but sensibility remains untouched. We will see as we go along. Childhood and imagined India. Naipaul was born at Chaguanas Borough in central Trinidad, in the Twin Island Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, on 17th August 1932. A descendant of indentured Indian grandparents, he was initially brought up in his maternal grandmother's house in the small town of Chaguanas before moving to the capital city of Port of Spain in 1938 to live in a house owned by his maternal grandmother. He left Trinidad in 1950 to take up a Trinidad government scholarship at the University College, Oxford, where he spent 4 years. He began his writing career in London in 1954, made Wiltshire in England his home, and died in London on 11th August 2018. As a child, Naipaul was socialized at home and in school in colonial Trinidad when the Hindu community elders were reconstituting a unitary Hinduism in the diaspora. Naipaul's maternal grandparents' family, being influential Hindu Pandits, had stubbornly resisted Christian overtures by adhering to their religious sacraments, including kathas and pujas. Excepting his maternal grandfather, none from Naipaul's ancestral family on either father's or mother's side had visited India after settling down in Trinidad. Like, in fact, his sister, his elder sister, she came to India on a fellowship to study in Banaras. She spent 4 years, 1949 to 53. But none of his ancestors had come back, excepting his maternal grandfather. He made 2 trips to India. On the second trip, he passed away in India. Like a majority of the indentured immigrants, according to Naipaul, his maternal grandfather had abandoned India and denied Trinidad. This is the quandary of many an Indian diasporic in present times too. They do not want to be here in India. They do not belong in their immigrant country. They manifest a form of alienated social personality, a marginalized existence. In the case of Naipaul, it was doubly so, as he was twice displaced. His ancestors had abandoned India and he had rejected Trinidad. He could neither be in India nor in Trinidad. For him, this was not a loss. It provided a vantage point from which to make his observations and commentary on both. Thus, recapitulating his experiences on his first visit to India in 1962, in his book, India, A Wounded Civilization, Naipaul writes, India is for me a difficult country. It is not my home and cannot be my home, and yet I cannot reject it or be indifferent to it. I am at once too close and too far. In India, I know I am a stranger, but increasingly I understand that my Indian memories, the memories of that India which lived on into my childhood in Trinidad, are like trapdoors into a bottomless past. India had in a special way been the background of Naipaul's childhood, though it was a country never described and therefore never real, a country, he says, suspended in time. He writes, more than in people, India lay about us in things, in a string bed or two, in a plated straw mats, what we would call in Kannada chape, in innumerable brass vessels, in drums and one ruined harmonium, in brightly colored pictures of deities on pink lotus are radiant against Himalayan snow, and in all the paraphernalia of the prayer room, the brass bells and gongs and camphor burners like Roman lamps, the slender-handled spoon for the doling out of the consecrated nectar, the images, the smooth pebbles, the stick of sandalwood. As a child, Naipaul was exposed to the Ramayana. He writes, I did not have to be taught it. The story was like something I had always known. This could be true of any Trinidadian. I think Trinidadians seem to know Ramayana more thoroughly than most Indians, you say, would know. Because for them, this was some sort of a national, you say, text of the diaspora. The Ramlila, he remembers as the first public things that he had been taken to as a child. Growing up in the Orthodox family of his maternal grandmother, he had watched many Hindu customs and rituals, but he confesses, I remained totally ignorant of Hinduism. He adds, I had no belief, I disliked religious rituals, and I had a sense of the ridiculous. He refused to go through the Geneva or the thread ceremony. which he describes as the ancient drama absurdly surviving in a Trinidad yard. He confesses that I was without belief or interest in belief. I was incapable of worship of God or holy men. Yet he felt saddened by the thought of the decay of the old customs and reverences. The India in Trinidad, which was the background to his childhood and school years, the India that had produced so many of the persons and things around him, was featureless. It was, Naipaul writes, an area of the imagination, not the real country, that was formed by religious rituals that he observed, the conversations that he heard, books that he read, and films that he watched. Naipaul was 18 years of age when he left Trinidad for England in 1950. By then, he found that his interest in India was failing, but it was this country, an area of darkness, that was to consume his interest as a literature for the rest of his life once he began his exploration in 1962. It was the year in which he writes, some little feeling for India as the mythical land of my childhood was awakened. So I will discuss these three books separately and then say conclude. First, an area of darkness. I title this section as Exploring an Area of Darkness. Naipaul's tryst with the real India, which was to last for over the next half a century, began in 1962. He arrived in Bombay, now Mumbai, on 18th March that year. Starting that very day and lasting his year-long sojourn in the country, Naipaul had to process the India and the Indians that he encountered in the background of the India of his imagination, the mythical land of his childhood. As Paul Theroux puts it, Naipaul was not a prodigal son, but a foreigner who looked Indian, but who did not speak the language or have the support of any local relatives. He felt, that's what Naipaul says, for the first time in my life, I was one of the crowd. But he says, I knew that I was not part of it. He felt he was one of the crowd, but he knew he was not part of it. Naipaul was both bewildered and enraged by much of what he saw and experienced. He was appalled by the lack of civic sense among Indians. Open defecation, piled up garbage, spitting on public wall, inside offices, the list goes on. He wrote angrily, Indians defecate everywhere. They defecate mostly beside the railway tracks, but they also defecate on the beaches. They defecate on the hills. They defecate on the river banks. They defecate on the streets. They never look for cover. Of course, they uninhibitedly urinate similarly too. If Naipaul had visited India now, he would have surely observed the civilized urbanites of the country taking their pedigree dogs to defecate in public parks and near roadside curbs. Indians, to be sure, were upset by his candid observations. Farooq Dondi, say in one of his pieces, he interviewed Naipaul at length. In one of his writings on Naipaul, Farooq Dondi recalls what his father had to tell about the first book, The Area of Darkness. He described it as gutter inspector's report. that was it was an outrage, gutter inspector's report. Our sensitivity was outraged. But what about our sensibility? It was only in 2014, that is 50 years after the publication of the first edition of An Area of Darkness, that the government of India embarked on Swachh Bharat Abhiyan, a countrywide campaign to eradicate open defecation and improve solid waste, an euphemism for garbage management. I join you all in the hope that this mission would not suffer the fate of its predecessor, the Nirmal Bharat Abhiyan, initiated in 2009. Many may not have even heard of that Abhiyan. It is just lost in history. However, going by Naipaul's observation, on the Indian way of seeing things, the squatting figures would not be spoken of or written about. They are not mentioned in novels or stories. They do not appear in feature films or documentaries. The one sociological work in which I have read, may come across the reference to this, is M.N. Srinivasa's Remembered Village. It's the only book. Otherwise, sociologists would not touch upon this. We leave it to social workers. The truth, however, is that Indians do not see the squatters and might even with complete sincerity deny that they exist, says Naipaul. That is, a fundamental deficiency of Indians, according to Naipaul, is their inability or unwillingness to see things as they are. It is an Indian method of argument, an Indian way of seeing. It is so that squatters and wayside filth begin to disappear. I think all of us, you say, I think are guilty of, you see, this, or perhaps this is the way, you say, we look at things. The collective blindness, as Naipaul terms this, arises out of the Indian fear of pollution. He finds the root of such collective blindness in the caste system, which implied a brutal division of labor. Naipaul describes caste as degrees of degradation and vehemently critiques this practice. A knowledge of degree, he observes, is in the bones and no Indian is far from his origins. It is like a physical earning. Let alone sanitation, even the incongruous roles of the Western world get incorporated into the rule of degree. Physical labor too is degradation. Naipaul makes a unique distinction between class and caste and the implications of the latter. He writes, class is a system of rewards. Caste imprisons a man in his function. From this it follows, since there are no rewards, the duties and responsibilities become irrelevant to position. A man is his proclaimed function. Thus, in the bygone past, caste may have been a useful division of labor in a rural society, but now, as Naipaul observes, it has divorced function from the social obligation, position from duties. It is ineffective and destructive. It has created a psychology which will frustrate all improving plans. Naipaul recognizes the pervasive deleterious consequence of caste ideology. Although he came to develop an intense disgust for the caste system and its ethos, he confesses that caste in his Trinidad days was capable on occasions of influencing my attitude to others. The thought still occurs when we meet, and that initial sniffing for distance is now involuntary. No wonder the ethos of caste has consumed even its victims. We do have instances of the once victims of caste practicing discrimination against others based on their caste. I hope, as you would, that the Swachh Bharat Abhiyan will be more than merely symbolic. A photo op for politicians and celebrities ceremonially sweeping an otherwise clean street or picking up plastic bottles thrown randomly for the purpose. I know, I hope in vain. You will recognize the symbolic actions that Naipaul observed in India. This is his writing. Tree planting week. 70% of the trees planted die from lack of attention after the speeches. Anti-fly week, declared in one state before the flies came. Children's Day, a correct speech by Mr. Nehru about children on the front page of the newspaper, and on the back page, a report that free milk intended for poor children had found its way to the Calcutta open market. And Malaria Eradication Week, help eradicate malaria, dubbed in English on the walls of illiterate Hindi-speaking villages. They're all symbolic. Of course, we can add to this list from more recent times. Naipaul writes, symbolic action was the curse of India. His analysis of symbolic action in relation to caste is insightful. He writes, an Eastern conception of dignity and function reposing on symbolic action. This is the dangerous, decayed pragmatism of caste. Symbolic dress, symbolic food, symbolic worship. India deals in symbols, in action. Inaction arising out of proclaimed function and function out of caste. Untouchability is not the most important effect of the system. A Western conception of dignity alone has made it so. But at the heart of the system lies the degradation of the latrine cleaner and that casual defecation in a veranda which Gandhi observed in 1901. Naipaul declares that social welfare measures like reservations may only scratch the surface of the system. It is a system, he says, that has to be regenerated, the psychology of caste that has to be destroyed. Speaking of symbolic action, Naipaul notes that even Gandhi had to deal in symbols. So latrine cleaning became an occasional ritual, virtuous because sanctioned by the great soul, Mahatma. The degradation of the latrine cleaner continued. On the one hand, Gandhi cleans the latrine, but the degradation of the latrine cleaner continued. The spinning wheel did not dignify labor. It was only absorbed into the great Indian symbolism, its significance rapidly failing. Now, we do that, you see, when a visitor comes from USA, it may be Trump or Boris Johnson who goes to Ahmedabad, you see, spins, but nobody cares, you see, for that later on. Given the turn of events, Naipaul regards Gandhi as a tragic paradox. I wish Professor Nadkarni was here. Indian nationalism, this is what Naipaul writes, Indian nationalism grew out of Hindu revivalism. This revivalism, which Gandhi so largely encouraged, made his final failure certain. He succeeded politically because he was reverenced. He failed because he was reverenced. His failure is there in his writings. He is still the best guide to India. True to the spirit of symbolic action, both Gandhi and Gandhism have been reduced to symbols. Naipaul points out that India undid Gandhi. He, quote, he became a Mahatma. He was to be reverenced for what he was. His message was irrelevant. So nothing remains of Gandhi in India but this, his name and the worship of his image, the seminars about nonviolence, as though this was all he taught, prohibition, rich in symbolism and righteousness, and the politician's garb. Thus, as early as in 1964, Naipaul observed that in India, Gandhi has already receded. He might have lived in the days when scribes wrote on leaves and strips of brass and people traveled on foot. Very sad, but true. Another point to which Naipaul draws our attention is the damage that colonialism and foreign rule had wrought on India and among its people for almost 5 centuries. First the Mughals, then the East India Company, and finally the British Crown. The Mughals ruled India, converted sections of her population to Islam, but stayed back in the country. The British colonial rulers looted the country, but had no intention of staying back, though they left a community of miscegenates, the Anglo-Indians. The British Raj, Naipaul writes, was an expression of the English involvement with themselves rather than with the country that they ruled. This explains why the British withdrawal from India was easy, why after less than 20 years, India has almost faded out of the British consciousness. Naipaul, however, goes beyond the looting of India under British colonialism. I think the best book on that subject is Shashi Tharoor, An Era of Darkness. He documents extremely well what happened during the British rule in India, Era of Darkness. He highlights how the prolonged subjection of India to foreign rule, and especially the British colonialism, has resulted in the intellectual enervation of Indians and created and fostered what the Nobel Prize winning poet and author of Polish-Lithuanian origin, Cesla Milos has called elsewhere a captive mind. I have used this concept in analyzing the status of sociology in India in a recent article in the seminar. The title is The Mimic Sociology. This manifests in many ways. The simple craze for foreign things. I am craze for foreign, just craze for foreign, was the chant of Mrs. Mahindra, at whose house in New Delhi, Naipaul was a paying guest. We know that this craze is not just for foreign things, it has extended to even ideas that are foreign. Do not our universities place a premium on foreign degrees and publications in international journals? Green cards, PR, permanent residency, and immigration visas are part of the middle class aspirational framework now. More on the intellectual implications of the captive mind syndrome later, but one disease that is eating into the vitals of our collective existence as a nation calls for immediate mention here. That disease is corruption. Of course, it is easy to be complacent about corruption and nepotism, as it is not a uniquely Indian problem. You may recall that a former prime minister even declared that it is a global phenomenon. That corruption exists in other countries does not justify its existence by any moral or legal yardstick. Naipaul's take on this subject is unique. As part of the ruling strategy, the British colonial rulers introduced a series of laws and rules, an institutional system to administer them, and a magisterial, including police, mechanism to obtain compliance. Independent India inherited this system of laws and institutions as a colonial legacy, the system and laws that were meant to rule over a subject population. Not much thought was ever given to their relevance in the governance of citizens of an independent republic. It is after 75 years, we are now discussing the relevance of sedition law. This should have gone lock, stock, and barrel immediately after independence. If you look at the Indian Penal Code, of course, even section numbers are same with Singapore. I was reading something from Singapore, you see, Penal Code, and the section numbers are the same. What Macaulay, you see, did has remained with us. That was a code written, you see, for ruling a subject population, not citizens. That we have retained, you see, that since then. Many of these laws, including the penal code, are still on the statute book. This has encouraged red tapeism, a colonial expression again, and provided scope for much corruption in day-to-day civic matters. The more and intricate the rules, greater the corruption is a truism. Those who have the resources do bribe and negotiate the system. Those lacking the resources, the poor and the gullible, suffer. They will be made to run from pillar to post. This is a good exercise. Try not giving bribe to in getting a driving license or tax assessment certificate for your house. You will experience what it is. I have some experience of both. Refusing to pay bribe to get an income tax. That is the only driving license. That is the only examination I have failed in my life. Then not paying, you say, bribe to get tax assessed for the house. And I have a rich experience of that, and I have paid through the nose. Nearly 6 times, you see, the tax as my neighbor was paying. Now, it was very, very, of course, you learn a lot from the system. For many, corruption is a part of life. No disgrace attaches to it. Have you seen any politician ever been accused of bowing his head? No. If it is only small, people say, if it is 25 crores, then you can. 250 crores, still more. So you find we are not shocked by, you see, this anymore. We have become complacent. No disgrace attaches to it. all, says, we take vows to make gifts to the deities in expectation of boons. That is, we offer money to God, you say, by way of corruption. You give me, you say, a, seat in a medical college or whatever it is. I will offer 250 coconuts or tender coconuts, whatever it is, and offer gifts for blessings received. If nothing else, there is karma. In fact, in his book, there are repeated quotations from Bhagavad Gita to say what sort of complacency you see that it has bred in us. In a year that he had spent in India, Naipaul states, he had not learned acceptance. I had learned my separateness from India and was content to be a colonial without a past, without ancestors. The separation and distance that he experienced from India of his childhood imagination was complete. He writes, the encounter had done more than dislodge a childhood memory. It awakened a superseded consciousness. As a high school student, Naipaul had been angered by reading Beverly Nichols' Verdict on India, a book published in 1944. He's a journalist who visited India in 1942-43. He spent few months and wrote a book called Verdict on India. Now he was angry with what he saw and experienced. One would have assumed that Naipaul would never again go to India. But his anger thawed over a decade. He tried to make a larger sense of what he had observed and experienced during his first visit to India in 1962-63. He wanted to explore the new events and dramatic changes that had been taking place in India since then. He wanted to re-examine the difficult country, as he calls it, and to re-evaluate his memories. He was now in a more confident mood, more detached, better informed. So he came to India again in August 1975 and spent a little over 1 year traveling in rural as well as urban areas, observing the turn of events and talking about them to the laypersons and the knowledgeable. That was a dark period in the history of independent India, marked by the infamous internal emergency. The result was his second book, India, a Wounded Civilization. I think the younger generation here have only heard of the emergency. I think in our generation, we have all experienced and we know what it meant. And I have a very unique experience. There is a journalist by name N. Jayaram. You may have seen him writing in Deccan Herald now and then. He those days wrote an article in Himmat. And that's a journal published from Bombay. And I had a relative working in the CID. He came one day evening waiting for me, and my mother was, why is he waiting for, you see, Jayaram? And I was working in the university, in the city campus library, and when I went home, he was there. Then he comes, calls me and says, what the hell are you doing? He asked me. I said, what? I've been writing, you see, all this nonsense. I said, no, I have not written anything. Then he takes out this copy from the bag and shows this. I said, that's not me. Fortunately, I was not taken along with others. I would have enjoyed the company of Vajpayee in Bangalore Central Jail if I had taken those days. But that did not happen. Fortunately, see, I assured him I have not done any such thing. Much later, I discovered, and I met this gentleman, my namesake, in a seminar, you see, in IIAS, when I spoke on Srinivas Centenary. He had come to see me because he had seen my name on the list. He came to see me, and I told him, you gave me a lot of, you see, trouble. I don't know, some of you must have read, he wrote a piece on namesake. That is, I also wrote, but they chose, you see, to publish his very interesting, but very interesting piece. Many people, he writes on things. He says, maybe people will think you have gone nuts, but please bear with me. I said, good. If the article is good, people will think I have written it is good credit for me. So that was emergency. And it was that time He came here and you see he was traveling, observing, etc. That's the work you say of this theme of the second book, Reflections on a Wounded Civilization. In 1977, in the foreword to India, A Wounded Civilization, Naipaul writes, India in the late 20th century still seems so much itself, so rooted in its civilization. It takes time to understand that its independence has meant more than the going away of the British, that the India to which independence came was a land of far older defeat, that the purely Indian past died a long time ago, and already with the emergency, it is necessary to fight against the chilling sense of a new dissolution. Naipaul is now convinced that an inquiry about India has to go beyond the political. He writes, it has to be an inquiry about Indian attitudes. It has to be an inquiry about the civilization itself as it is. Despite being a stranger in India, the starting point of this inquiry was Naipaul himself. He writes, because in myself, like the split-second images of infancy which some of us carry, they survive from the family rituals that lasted into my childhood, phantasmal memories of old India, which for me outline a whole vanished world. Naipaul's approach to and engagement with India in the second book is different from the first one. His observations are astute, and his experiences as insightful as they had been earlier. But instead of interpreting them sociologically in a straightforward way, as he had done in an area of darkness, in India, A Wounded Civilization, he chose to interpret them in the backdrop of fictional works of three well-known Indian literateurs, R.K. Narayan, Vijay Tendulkar, and U.R. Ananthamurthy. He uses the protagonists in their work, Srinivas in Mr. Sampath and Jagan in The Vendor of Sweets by Narayan, Sakaram in Sakaram Binder by Tendulkar, and Praneshacharya in Samskara by Ananthamurthy as sociological filters. His analysis reveals a civilization that is wounded from 5 centuries of subjugation to foreign rule, as well as from the decay set from within. In this book, we find Naipaul gradually transiting from derision of India to compassion for its predicament. There is a change in orientation. You don't get outraged by what he wrote. In Area of Darkness, you will definitely, it provokes you a lot. But the second one, the tone itself is, you see, different. The ruins of the great Hindu kingdom, Vijayanagar, established in the 14th century and conquered and destroyed by Muslim principalities in 1565, as ruins of kingdoms in Kashmir, Bihar, Delhi, and elsewhere in the country, are a metaphorical sign of the wound suffered by a civilization. All this once great kingdom has been left with is a peasantry that cannot comprehend the idea of change. He describes an individual who is standing on a hillock and looking at Vijayanagar ruins. He says, for him, it does not make any sense. He is taking care of his goats. For him, he cannot place, you see, this in the larger, broader intellectual, you see, scene. He wonders about the intellectual depletion that must have come to India with the invasions and conquests of the last 1,000 years. He bemoans the fact that in history books, in the accounts of wars and conquests and plunder, the intellectual depletion passes unnoticed. Of course, Indians often claim that India absorbs and outlaws its conquerors. But standing amidst the ruins of Vijayanagar, Naipaul wonders whether intellectually for 1,000 years, India had not always retreated before its conquerors, and whether in its period of apparent revival, India had not only been making itself archaic again, intellectually smaller, always vulnerable. Naipaul recalls R.K. Narayan's terse statement when he first met him in London in 1961. India will go on, R.K. Narayan, he said. Naipaul heard it again from others with whom he interacted in 1975-76 during the emergency. This is emblematic of the sense of an old equilibrium. He calls it the Hindu equilibrium. Naipaul analyzes the sense of this equilibrium and its collapse in the fictional characters of Narayan, Srinivas in Mr. Sampath, and Jagan in The Vendor of Sweets. The sense of complacency was jolted by the emergency, an arbitrary terror reaching out to high and low, but it came confused with a political crisis. Naipaul clarifies, the emergency established no new moral frame for the society. It held no promise for a better regulated future. It reinforced, if anything, the always desperate Hindu sense of the self, the sense of encircling external threat, the need to hide and hold. The eradication of poverty was spoken about, but those who spoke of that had forgotten Jawaharlal Nehru's fear about the deification of poverty. Gandhianism had had that effect, says Naipaul. In an area of darkness, Naipaul had aptly observed that poverty in India is especial and sad. Poverty not as an urge to anger or improving action, but poverty as an inexhaustible source of tears, an exercise of the purest sensibility. To be sure, the old Hindu equilibrium had been shattered and chaos was everywhere around. Naipaul noticed that out of this chaos, out of the crumbling of the old Hindu system and the spirit of rejection, India was learning new ways of seeing and feeling. He analyzes the new ways of seeing and feeling through the plays of Tendulkar and the portrayal of their protagonists. Although Tendulkar's India is the same country as Narayan's, it is a country, he says, to which change has come. The world has opened out and men have become more various and individualistic. The will rages. Sensibility has been modified. India is less mysterious. While on Tendulkar's city, Naipaul elucidates the socio-economic background of the rise of the xenophobic Shiv Sena and the limitations of its politics. His interactions with its committee workers at the grassroots level suggested to him that the middle-class leadership of the Sena might talk of martial glory and dream of political power. But at the lower and more desperate level, the Sena had become something else. A yearning for community, an ideal of self-help, men rejecting rejection. Municipal self-discipline was one of Gandhi's pet themes, but it was the Shiv Sena, he writes, that had, as it were, ritualized the municipal need, which independence, the Industrial Revolution, and the pressures of population had made urgent. A paradox. In one of the committee rooms of the Shiv Sena that Naipaul visited in a slum, he saw a portrait hung on the wall. He writes, not of the leader of Shiv Sena, that is Bal Thackeray, or of Shivaji, the Sena warrior god, but of Dr. Ambedkar, the champion of the Dalit cause. The irony. An educated committee member explains the garbage around the area by mentioning that the sweepers are on leave, that being Sunday. Naipaul fumes. Again, sweepers, the lowest of the low, their very existence and their acceptance of their function, the especial curse of India, reinforcing the Indian conviction, even here, and in spite of the portrait of Dr. Ambedkar in the committee room, that it was unclean to clean. I think no Indian I have come across has ever reflected to say this sort of a thing. We reflect, somebody asks, oh, your maid does not clean, you say, toilets in your house. We do it ourselves. But that idea still persists. It is unclean, you see, to clean. I think that is something, it is a fantastic, insight. All the same, Shiv Sena speaks in very interesting interpretation of that. I have found similar interpretation, in the writings of Dipankar Gupta. All the same, Shiv Sena was an organic socio-political growth of independent India. It comes from within. Its leaders and followers saw themselves at the beginning of things, unaccommodated men making a claim on their land for the first time, and out of chaos, evolving their own philosophy of community and self-help. Understandably, it carved a niche for itself in the social psyche of the Maharashtrians and particularly the Mumbaikars. In contrast, was a movement that began with a bang but petered out to be a dangerous nuisance, the Naxalite movement. The Naxalite movement originated in Naxalbari, the district in the far north of West Bengal in 1968. Naipaul rightly observes that it was not a spontaneous uprising and it was not locally led. It was organized by communists from outside. Though it spread to other parts of the country, especially Andhra Pradesh in the south, it was severely policed and eventually crumbled. It was a middle class rather than a peasant tragedy. It engaged the sympathies of university students, often to the despair of their parents. As one of Naipaul's interviewees put it, in the Naxalite movement, India had lost the best of a whole generation, the most educated and idealistic of its young people. Naipaul remarks that the Naxalite movement, a tactically absurd attempt at Maoist revolution, hardly succeeded in teaching its complex theology to people used to reverencing a master and used for centuries to the idea of karma. As a communist journalist told Naipaul, the movement seemed to have preached only the idea of the enemy, the class enemy, a theory endorsed by Tendulkar, who was sympathetic to the Naxalite cause. It was Tendulkar's theory that Naxalism, as it developed in Bengal, became confused with the Kali cult. Kali, the emblem of female destructiveness. Naipaul concludes, Naxalism was an intellectual tragedy, a tragedy of idealism, ignorance, and mimicry. Middle-class India, after the Gandhian upheaval, incapable of generating ideas and institutions of its own, needing constantly in the modern world to be inducted into the art, science, and ideas of other civilizations, not always understanding the consequences, and this time borrowing something deadly, somebody's idea of revolution. While on socio-political movements, Naipaul draws our attention to how, in India, individual obsessions coalesce into political movements. Many of these movements look back to the past, which they reinterpret to suit their needs. The Shiv Sena in Mumbai, the Dravidian movement in the south, Naipaul observes, have positive regenerating effects. But others like the Anand Marg, as if an inversion of Gandhianism, are the grossest kind of Hindu cult. Naipaul also commented on the contradiction in the ideology of the Janasangh, the precursor of the present-day Bharatiya Janata Party, a party which seeks a nuclear armory for India and combines that with a program for protecting the holy cow. Ordinary Indians do not pay much attention to these developments, which might seem quaint to an outsider. But Naipaul emphasizes that all this is an aspect of the deep disturbance of India, a wounded civilization, at a time of difficult change. In this context, he refers to the predicament of men like Praneshacharya, the protagonist in Anantamurti Samskara, who, he says, find themselves thrown out into the world and formless and strive in the only ways open to them to become human again. Another facet of the wound inflicted by colonialism on India, briefly discussed in this book, is elaborated in the briefly discussed in the first book, is elaborated in the second book, that is the bewitchment of mind, resulting in Indians mimicking the English and the West more generally. Naipaul had heard about the gift of Indians for cultural synthesis, which referred to the pre-British past, to the time of Muslim dominance. That great tradition died, he writes, in the 19th century with the coming of the British. According to him, complex imported ideas forced through the retort of Indian sensibility often come out cleansed of content and harmless. They seem so regularly to lead back through religion and now science to the past and nullity. He gives the illustration of the idea of intermediate technology, which was spoken of in the mid-1970s. I think Professor Deshpande, Professor Aziz would remember, seminars were held on this subject. No one hears of it anymore. Whether it is intermediate technology or poverty, the rich countries dictate the guiding ideas, which are the ideas of the rich about the poor, ideas sometimes about what is good for the poor, and sometimes no more than expression of alarm. Indian scholars pick these ideas up in seminars and conferences and foundation fellowships abroad. What still, the rich countries even export their romantic doubts about industrial age civilization. These are the doubts that attend every kind of success, great success, and they are romantic because they contain no wish to undo that success or to lose the fruits of that success. Indians interpret these doubts in their own debilitating way and use them to reconcile themselves to their own failure. Naipaul makes a serious point here. He writes, India blindly swallows its past. What is the problem? The problem is, he writes, to understand that past, it has had to borrow alien academic disciplines, and as with the technology, their foreign origin shows. He writes, history with its nationalist shrillness, sociology with its mathematical approach and its tables, these disciplines remain borrowed. They have as yet given India little idea of itself, he observes. Journalists too, Naipaul remarks, are guilty of this mimicry. The futility of this mimicry is evident in that to know their country, ordinary Indians consult themselves, their caste, clan, family traditions. They don't consult to say sociologists. What sociologists write, you say, has absolutely no relevance to them. Intellectual parasitism on other civilization is a wound that the civilization of India would take a long time to heal. Naipaul notes, the Indo-British encounter was abortive. It ended in a double fantasy. Their new self-awareness makes it impossible for Indians to go back. Their cherishing of Indianness make it difficult for them to go ahead. It's a very well put. Their new self-awareness makes it impossible for Indians to go back. Their cherishing of Indianness makes it difficult for them to go ahead. About this, he quotes Sudhir Kakad as follows. To be critical and not to be swept away in a flood of archaic emotions is a much greater effort for us Indians. And Kakad says, I include myself. The Indian intellectual struggle is on two fronts, inner and outer. For it has been our developmental fate that, in contrast to, say, France or Germany, it has always been earliest childhood that was seen to be the golden period of individual life history, just as the remotest past is considered to be the golden age of Indian history. I think all of us do that. I think those who have children, we always tell about how nice our time was, we say to our children. I think we're all guilty of that. But this is, Kakad says, is part of the Indian psychological, makeup. The last book. India, a Wounded Civilization, is a more closely argued book than an area of darkness. It was not, however, a travel book, more an extended essay, which required travel for testimony, travel with a theme. After he wrote these two celebrated books on India, Naipaul's mother advised him, "Beta, leave India to the Indians." But Naipaul was not done with India. His exploration was not complete yet. He visited India again in December 1988 for a year-long sojourn intellectual journey. The result, the classic India, A Million Mutinies Now. This is the longest book, and to me, the best and most important book in Naipaul's Indian trilogy. This is also Naipaul's most compassionate, most patient, and forgiving book, as Paul Thoreau describes it. It is least judgmental and least opinionated, a complete turnaround from an area of darkness. Although it is in continuation of the first two books, it is different in its approach and orientation. In this book, Naipaul combines thick description of what he observed with in-depth interviews with a variety of people. Unlike in the first two books, in this book, he skillfully weaves his interpretation into the narrative flow. This book could indeed be regarded as a masterpiece in qualitative sociology. Much had changed in India during the 27 years since Naipaul's first visit in 1962 to the country of his 19th century indentured ancestors. During this period, Naipaul writes, he had succeeded in shedding, in his words, shedding my Indian nerves, abolishing the darkness that separated me from my ancestral past. He writes, what I had not understood in 1962 or had taken too much for granted was the extent to which the country had been remade and even the extent to which India had been restored to itself after its own equivalent of the Dark Ages, after the Muslim invasions and the detailed repeated vandalizing of the North, the shifting empires, the wars, the 18th century anarchy. The 20th century restoration of India to itself had taken time. It could even seem like a kind of luck. India was set on the way of a new kind of intellectual life. It was given new ideas about its history and civilization. The freedom movement reflected all this and turned out to be the truest kind of liberation. The sociologist in Naipaul saw all over India scores of particularities that had been frozen by foreign rule or by poverty or lack of opportunity or abjectness had begun to flow again. This made the independence struggle seem like an interim, writes Naipaul. Independence had come to India like a kind of revolution. Now there were many revolutions within that revolution. He sums this up thus. A million mutinies supported by 20 kinds of group excess, sectarian excess, religious excess, regional excess, the beginnings of self-awareness, it would seem the beginnings of an intellectual life already negated by old anarchy and disorder. But there was in India now that did not exist 200 years before. A central will, a central intellect, a national idea. The Indian Union was greater than the sum of its parts, and many of these movements of excess strengthened the Indian state, defining it as the source of law and civility and reasonableness. The Indian Union gave people a second chance, calling them back from the excesses with which, in another century or in other circumstances, they might have had to deal. The destructive chauvinism of the Shiv Sena, the tyranny of many kinds of religious fundamentalism, the film star corruption and racial politics of the South, the pious Marxist idleness and nullity of Bengal. No wonder Indians who had grown up with another idea of India and its development could feel alienated and insecure. Naipaul's analysis In Naipaul's analysis, I see why sociologists and other social scientists in India, with their imported analytical frameworks, have failed to grasp the turn of events in contemporary India. When we lack analytical tools, when we do not have explanatory things, we start using cliches, we start using, you say, terms very freely. Naipaul elucidates his Million Mutinies thesis through detailed narratives of his in-depth interviews with a variety of people across the country: a Jain stockbroker, a Maharashtrian journalist, a few Shiv Sena leaders, two Bombay underworld dons, an enterprising pujari, an employee of an advertising company, a private secretary to a business politician, a purohit, scientist, an engineer, a minister in a non-Congress government in Karnataka, a Muslim politician, a proprietor of a printing publishing house, some ex-Naxalites, and more. But more important are his interviews, insightful interviews with some people. I mentioned 7 of them. One is Namdev Dasal, the Marathi Dalit poet, whom Vijay Tendulkar compared to the 16th century Maharashtrian poet Saint Tukaram, and the founder of the Dalit Panthers, and his wife Mallika. 2. K. Veeramani, the philosophical heir to the founder of the Dravidian movement, Erode Venkatappa Ramaswamy, well known as Periyar. 3. Sadanand Menon, a writer. And 4. Sugar, a friend, mentioned as Sugar, he does not give the name, a friend whom Naipaul had met on his Amarnath Yatra in 1962, and Kakustan, an Orthodox Brahmin, all now living in Madras. Then the Mukteshwar, the personal Brahmin priest of the last Maharaja of Mysore, and an IAS officer and a squadron leader, both retired and both sick. Equally interesting and insightful are Naipaul's analysis of the changing urban predicament of the then Bangalore, Bombay, Calcutta, Lucknow, and Madras. The slums and child life in Bombay, the religiosity of the gangsters, the very interesting. How come the gangsters are so religious? The Ayyappa cult, the Ganapati festival, the anti-Brahman movement in Tamil Nadu, the Portuguese colonialism in Goa, the restlessness in the Kashmir Valley, and the tragedy of extremist violence in Punjab, resulting in the Operation Blue Star and the assassination of Srimati Indira Gandhi. Naipaul's interviews and analysis are best savored in their original. They can hardly be served in a summary. However, I should mention a few of his original insights based on his observations and interviews. Scientist Subramaniam, Naipaul's Brahmin interviewee, mentions how the cultural capital of the Brahmins sustained them in the face of the assault from the anti-Brahmin movement. His father had done science and had literary friends, and they often discussed science, religion, and culture in the house. Naipaul is reminded of his own Indian family background in Trinidad. He writes, I felt that the physical conditions of our life, often poor conditions, told only half the story. That the remnants of the old civilization we possessed gave the in-between colonial generation a second scheme of reverences and ambitions, and that this equipped us for the outside world better than might have seemed likely. Only thing is, sociologists today use the word social capital or socio-cultural capital, but Naipaul does not use that. There is a perceptive observation about the South and Bengal contrast in science. In the South, he writes, science had grown over 2 or 3 generations out of the Brahminical tradition of abstract learning. In Bengal, in the British-built city of Calcutta, science had come with the new learning. Scientific achievement had come out of colonial competitiveness and the wish of Indians to prove themselves. Then there is a deeper irony of the anti-Brahman movement. The anti-Brahman movement, Naipaul writes, was not a movement of all the non-Brahmin castes. It was a movement mainly of the middle castes. There was, as ever in India, a further lower level, a further level of disadvantage. For these people at the very bottom, the DMK offered no protection. In fact, in present-day Tamil Nadu, the dominant landed groups are the oppressors of the hapless Dalits. Finally, on the Muslim predicament in post-independence Lucknow and elsewhere in India, Naipaul's interviews with 2 knowledgeable Muslims provide interesting insights. Rashid is depressed by comparison to the community's glorious past. Muslims once ruled here, set the tone. Now they had been depleted by the middle class migration to Pakistan. And in spite of the esteem in which individuals are held, as a group, they ranked low. The non-veiled Parveen, with ambition to be a secular politician, was of the view that the Muslims of the Chowk or Bazaar were trapped in their ignorance and it was hard to get through to them. Naipaul observes, in a purely Muslim country, people might have been less tense about the faith and nerves might have been less raw. But here it was known that what lay outside the lands and passageways of the Chowk was outside the faith. And from this world outside, there came threats and provocations. Ironical as it may sound, Naipaul concludes the mutinies were not to be wished away. They were part of the beginning of a new way for many, many millions, part of India's growth, part of restoration. I find the 3-4 things that I have explained, there are many more. They can all be used as hypotheses for further research, not a final conclusion. For instance, the contrast between science in South and science in Bengal. He makes an important, you can formulate it as a hypothesis, you see, to test. Similarly, you say on the Muslim predicament that he says, some scholars you say have done work comparing, you say, the political scientist who compared pairs of cities. Here, Ashutosh Varshney. Like that, the points you say are articulated in such a way in Naipaul's book. For any sociologist reading it, you get good hypothesis. You need not have to take them as conclusions. You can treat them as hypotheses for further work. Conclusion. Naipaul is not a sociologist, but his writings are characterized by sociological imagination. I find an equivalent. Lefebvre, you say, writes about Marx. Marx was not a sociologist, but there was a lot of sociology in what Marx wrote. Like that, Naipaul is not a sociologist, but his writings are characterized by sociological imagination. His methods of information collection, I would call it participant observation, empathy and self-criticism, reflexivity, and analysis, interpretive narration, were essentially sociological, though he did not describe them as such. I take this quotation from my earlier article, which I have published in Sociological Bulletin based on my Gurye Memorial lecture on Naipaul's first 4 novels. How, in the absence of anthropological, you see, information of the 30s and 40s Trinidad or 50s Trinidad, the best source, you say, is Naipaul's early novels. You can, so I have analyzed the first 4 novels in that paper, 2022, I think early, you can read them, you see there. Reading his Indian trilogy, one cannot but admire his extraordinary narrative skills. It is not my contention that reading Naipaul and India is a substitute for doing sociology in India. But I am certainly convinced that there is much more to sociology than counting heads and collecting stories that we have been doing. Any Indian reading Naipaul's Indian trilogy, especially an area of darkness, is sure to be upset by it. I myself was when I first read it. But rereading it, the two from a sociological perspective, I realize that I would not allow, I realize that we should not allow our outraged sensitivities to impede us from appreciating the sensibilities that he touches. Naipaul's ambivalence towards India should not hold us back from looking at the mirror he holds for us. Naipaul would not lose much if we do not read his works, but we stand to gain from reading them. In his Indian trilogy, we see Naipaul realizing his self-knowledge vis-a-vis the land of his ancestors. We see the transformation in the relationship between the writer and the subject of his writing, much like the relationship between an ethnographer and the community he or she studies. Towards the end of the last book, Naipaul writes, as the grandson and great-grandson of agricultural immigrants from India, I had grown up with my own ideas of the distance that separated me from India. I was far enough away from it to cease to be of it. I knew the rituals but could not participate in them. I heard the language but followed only the simpler words. But I was near enough to understand the passions and near enough to feel that my own fate was bound up with the fate of the people of the country. Viewed in the light of Naipaul's inseparable relationship with India, which was once his area of darkness and whose wounds as a civilization that he tried to understand, we feel the warmth of these sentiments in his statement accepting the Nobel Prize. When he accepted the Nobel Prize, he said, "It is a great tribute to both England, my home, and India, the home of my ancestors." Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir, for offering this wonderful sociological understanding of Naipaul's the Trilogy. And then after reading hundreds of pages of the three books, and you are able to thousands, 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 1080 pages of his three books, and then you have offered us something that I don't know whether we will, any one of us have the patience to read, and we have lost the culture of reading books in any case. So the younger generation is more interested in WhatsApp and various other kinds of things, that you have read all this long number of pages, and then you have provided us a very good account of the way his perception of India changed from the first book to the last book, and when he accepted his Nobel Prize. So this is a truly very brilliant analysis, sociological analysis, and I particularly like the three things that because you have taught research methodology for such a long time, and then you find that you found the participant observation, reflexivity, and interpretive narration. I think this is something which the students here should learn, that how even from literature you can learn certain concepts for research methods and other things. So we are really very thankful to you for this wonderful lecture. And now I think this is a question and answer time, and then there are several of you already. I can see some hands going up, but I would like to make a statement that those who are online, I request you to raise your hand, and there is a icon. You can just raise your hand, and then we will give an opportunity. We'll unmute you, and then request you to pose your question. Sir, would you like to take some 2-3 questions together,
Sure,
and then take them? Okay.
But before I do that, one small point. If there are any students of sociology doing qualitative research, read the last book. It is an excellent guide for how to write qualitative research.
Yeah, that's very
Masterpiece, I would say. How to mix interviews with anecdotes and interpretations. I think it is a masterpiece.
So yeah, Anil, then.
Good afternoon, sir.
Good
Thank you very much for an excellent lecture. There is a point that I read The Wounded Civilization. I read The Wounded Civilization, though I have not read the remaining two. And I read many reviews of Naipaul and his reception in India. The reception of Naipaul in India is very critical. And he has been dubbed as, though methodologically and as an author, he's rich and so on. He has been identified with the right that he has called it a wounded civilization, and his identification has been different. And is a new appreciation of Naipaul reveal as the new reality of India?
Answer this? I think it's a very interesting thing. I have heard two sets of comments made. One is about Naipaul as a person. Okay. Now that I never touch, never answer, because we are not interested in person, but we are interested in what the person has written. Okay, that is point. Generally, you have not raised. The second one is they raise, this important issue. Now you are a social scientist yourself. Read all the three and come to the conclusion. Generally, what happens is when we read, we put on, our spectacles, our own ideological spectacles, then read. And depends on which spectacles you have used, you get a particular orientation to it. I will just give an illustration. I reviewed a book by S. Gopal, edited by S. Gopal, The Anatomy of a Confrontation. This was about the Babri Masjid, demolition days. I reviewed it in Deccan Herald. It received very interesting review. Some people call me, I'm a Marxist. Okay. Some people call me, I'm RSS. Now, those who call me Marxist were all wearing RSS spectacles, and those who call me RSS were wearing, I leave it to them. I don't think, very interestingly, Naipaul himself did not react to any of these. What I would say is, irrespective of right or left, if somebody is telling you what he is telling, take it for what it is worth. I think that is something that we should. Once we see, this is what happens. Once we give, that is, what they say, give. There's an expression for that they use, dog. Once you give a name to it, then your entire thing, as soon as you have used the word right, it has sent signal to many people, right? Not only you have yourself read it, as many people have criticized him as being right. But when you read the first two, you don't feel it. Towards the end of the second, you start feeling it, because he is trying, to tell you, you cannot forget, history. That's what he says. Those who do not like would not, read it. Very simple. And I have personally found, I have a lot of disagreement with certain things, about Naipaul, but on his observations, etc., he is pointing out, look at, this. Why don't we see? For instance, the entire idea of this area of darkness, where he speaks of our attitude towards garbage and the type of things. If you find, it took 50 years for us, for the government of India to embark on a national program. In fact, a country which was much poorer, much worse off in colonialism, like Trinidad, you would not find open defecation. How come we are not sensitive to it? This is a question that asks, how do we as a country deal with such issues?
It was really a wonderful thing. I enjoyed it, and enjoyed it so thoroughly. I have great respect for Professor Jayaram as a very good friend, as a senior. But for more than that, for one thing, usually a new officer in the chair tells that the old officer did not do this, he did not look at that, he did not look at that. But then Professor Jayaram, my predecessor, was so supportive to me that almost every month I used to consult him, and he was with me in everything that I did through my 5 years. That's the kind of very dispassionate about any analysis. So I don't put him either Marxist or RSS or right or left. He is dispassionate about things, the things as clear as possible. Coming to the lecture, this is
a personal thing. But coming to the lecture, it's wonderful to analyze a time series out of a cross section. Speaking economics, time series out of a cross section that at different points of time, different observations by made by socially active persons. And these observations are put in place in order to build a story together, a wonderful methodological paradigm, which is not used in neither in economics, oh sorry, in economics it has been used by Gilbert Etene. Gilbert Etene traveled through India 3 times, and then he wrote about how India changed. He traveled from north to south, how India changed over 50, 60 years. He is no more. But then that is something which Professor Jayaram tried to do in this. There is one important observation, and I think we need to brood on that, and you can react to it. The concept of development, our concept of development is what he does is better for me. And that is something which is in our DNA, and therefore our styles, our writing, our disciplines, our accepting of the new softwares. Oh, no, e-views have come. After all, you are using SPSS. Why SPSS? E-views is there. Hey, you do this, you do that, and buy a new software. The kind of thing is, what is going on in the neighbor's house is development. What is going on in my house is backwardness. And that's something which you brought it out. Imported analytical framework is something which has eroded Indian thinking, or our thinking for that matter. The better econometrics is better research. You said that better the externally, what? International journal. The second observation is about the Hindu equilibrium. The Indian society, and Deepak Lal has written exactly on that. The title itself is Hindu Equilibrium in 2 volumes. The kind of society India has, acha, chalne do. Irutte. Irli bidi. The open defecation is one part of it. That what can we kuch nahi kar sakte. We can't do anything. And that's something which is a forced equilibrium on a disequilibria, which should have been observed from within. The crafting, that is last thing, the crafting of or weaving of the issues through the 3 novels. And I'm sure that this weaving of the issues, certainly every individual undergoes change over time in his or her thinking. Naipaul also has undergone change in his or his thinking over time. Now, that is one thing which you needed to highlight, because from the 62 novel to 78 and to the million mutinies, 3 places, the thinking of the author itself has undergone change, as well as his theoretical base. Now, what is that? That need to be brought out. It's a wonderful lecture, sir. I think enjoyed thoroughly the entire thing. Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Deshpande, for your very kind words about our relationship when I was here as director. I just to add, you did not find me either as an RSS or Marxist. If somebody were to ask me, who am I would say I am a Jayaramist. Why should I mortgage, you say, my intellect and my way of thinking? Of course, I borrow from everything which is good, which I feel good, but I have my own, you see, opinion. So
I define dispassionate, and
that is the standard that, but I get bangings from both. Neither of them, you say, include me in their dispensation, so that as long as the left, you say, controlled ICSSR, only one personal friend I had, Javed. He, you say, had lot of respect for me. But after that, ICSR does not even look at me now, because it thinks, as somebody said, you say, he's a Marxist. So you have to live with it. And all this, Professor Deshpande, matters if you look for positions, favors, etc., as long as you don't care for these awards, fellowships and things like that, you are very safe. You are free. Nobody bothers you. The second point, it is very interesting that you mentioned cross-section and linear analysis. True. There are some sociologists who did some revisits, and one sociologist whom I think Professor Karanthus knew when he was in Lund was Stefan Lundberg. He was, you say, interested in society in Tamil Nadu, and he tracked it for almost 50 years. And he passed away a few years back, but his thing, whoever says India has not changed, he showed me some photographs which he has taken recently, and the photographs that he took the first time when he traveled in those villages. Of course, some of those children, you see, have all grown up to be elders in 50 years. They are parents and grandparents, but the setup that he shows reveals remarkable, you see, change. Perhaps a scholar like Sasanka Pereira would write about what he calls visual anthropology. No? Pictures capture ideas much better than however much we use the word. That was a very good, interesting point, and thanks for reference to Etne and Deepak Lal. Maybe there is some time where I can integrate some of these things. If I rework on that, I will take it up. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And then Professor Chandan Gowda is there. And then I also would like to request our friend, the sociologist friends. There are 2-3 of them online. There,
Naipaul was not a sociologist, though I regard him as one.
no, but about sociological reading. Okay, first let's begin with Professor Chandan. Who, Karant? Professor Karant, can you mute? Yeah, please. Yeah, that you can now intervene. You can just ask a question or observation.
Am I audible?
Very well.
Thank you. First of all, I don't like to repeat everything that Professor Deshpande said, but I think he summed up the general mood of almost everyone here, both online and offline. A wonderful talk and thoroughly enjoyed. I must confess I haven't read Naipaul, and even after he got the Nobel, a couple of statements that he made me one of those instantaneous nationalism that I had kind of put me off from reading him seriously. But thank you for this lecture. This is a wonderful invitation for me too to visit and revisit Naipaul. But you have laid out a wonderful sketch for us to look at. One question that came across as I was listening to you, Jayaram, Professor Jayaram, that is over the period with which he has engaged himself in writing these the three works that you referred to what extent do you find a change in himself as an author? Especially as a scholar of diaspora studies, to what extent do you find a transformation? Because some of his early preoccupations obviously did not find a place in his later works, or the way he looks at them has certainly modified. But that has to be juxtaposed to the 30 odd years of a radical social change that happened in India, especially the post-independence, post-emergency, and then the reforms India that we had, the digitized India that we have, or the globalized India that we have. So to what extent do we find the change in this three, or the transformation of an India picture that we get, is a result of the author undergoing a change, or India undergoing a change, or maybe both? Just a comment is enough on that.
I think I'm sorry I did not make that point in a very emphatic way, though, as Professor Deshpande mentioned, it was in the narrative. If you look at, you see the first one, which was written 15 years after India became independent. And at that time, he himself was 29 years old. When he wrote the second one, he was 29 plus 13, 32, 42 years old. And the last one he wrote, he was 55 years old. That is a period in which you find remarkable change in him as a writer in relation, you see, to India. That is very evident in the three books. And that is my entire thrust. Not only the way, it was not just, you see, he was coming and writing. The way he wrote Area of Darkness, and there, the way he interpreted the things. When he moved to the Wounded Civilization, his entire, the filters that he used, you see, repeatedly, characters from the three novels, the four novels of three writers, and many others also he mentions, but these three, definitely. It is a very interesting way of filtering your observations and interview information to make sense. And when it comes to the last one, it was entirely in the mode of what one would call qualitative sociology. Fully, if you read that, I still hold that as the best because I find very close association with it as a sociologist, the way it is written. So you find he undergoes, you see, transformation, and in his both in the way he approached, you see, India, and his own orientation to India. The first one, you see, as an area of darkness. When he came, he was so critical of practically everything. I think that is very, very important. I think what we do is we all want praise. We don't like, you see, criticism. As a country, we have thing. We feel, okay, we take things too personally. Whereas he was trying, you see, to point out, look at, you see, this. Why don't you, you see, reflect on your institutions, especially, say, police? Some of the things that he mentions, you see, in the first one should have been an eye-opener. Now notice, this defecation business, we only do one thing. We are very sensitive. We don't want to use the word defecation, and much less, you see, shit, because even our censors, you see, change it into crap. If you say bullshit, they will make it bull crap. I don't know why. Some of us may even have to attend nature's call. That makes it no way different. It is defecation. It is shitting in public. Very simple. I think he was telling us upfront, and it took us 50 years to think of defecation, open defecation free. Even now it is not. I think you have done some project recently, right? ISEC is doing project to see on that now. We never thought of that. It never occurred to us because there. I think perhaps if some foreigner friend asked me, I would even say, no, we don't have it in India, because I want to project a different image. I don't want to say, yes, in my own streets I have. I cannot, you see, be telling that. So he came, in a way, he was not comparable, you see, to Beverley Nichols. Beverley Nichols was a British, hardcore British journalist who was against India. Therefore, that was a different thing. Whereas in his case, he pointed out several, you see, limitations, deficiencies in us, but he had, you see, at the heart, an identity, you say, as some sort of an Indian. Now, if you compare this with his attitude to Trinidad, he described Trinidad as a half-made society. Huh? Huh? No, India is not. He compares Trinidad with India and England. Now, you notice he had abandoned Trinidad in such a way. When he got Nobel Prize, he did not even refer to Trinidad. The Trinidadians don't like him at all. Every Trinidadian, you say, has something negative to say, because like India, what he wrote in the Middle Passage and other essays on Trinidad is very critical, you see, of Trinidad too. He wrote critical things about England. So it is not that he was prizing one and putting down the other. So there is a change, you see, that you can see both in the way he dealt with India as what he observed in India, what he discussed in India. There is a change in the way he processed that information that underwent change over 26 quarter century. That is a separation of the 26 years, 3 books. And his orientation to India undergoes change from an area of darkness. The last one, he says, he has overcome, you see that. That is a remarkable thing. In the last book, there is also a honest confession that he had not understood India properly in 1962. He had overlooked things. I think that is a very rare thing to come across in, it's a true, honest, you see, that is a good character, you see, of a writer. Not to just forget that. He says, I had not processed it properly. I did not, you see, look at it properly. On hindsight, it appears to me, you see, to be different. I think that is I found it very, very interesting. I found, in fact, the first time, you say, I got into the literature was when I was working on my book, you see, on Indo-Trinidadians. I began it long ago. It's almost 20 years ago I began writing it, but it was never done. And as I was doing it, I found on many things, there was no information on a particular period in which this community was being made. Anthropologists started going there only after the 50s. So before that, you have colonial records, but no information. The only thing that you would get is from literatures. And one of the persons who did perhaps, the first one was his father, Naipaul, who wrote only one very instructive anthropological insight on Trinidad. Then his 2 sons, V.S. Naipaul and Shiva Naipaul. And Shiva Naipaul, you see, died very early. So we have only 2-3 books, and mostly on Trinidad, the 2 novels, you see, on Trinidad. But otherwise, we don't have it. Now we have scholarship post independence there. Now, after 1962, there is a lot of scholarship coming from people trained, you see, in the universities there, people who went from outside, both England and India, etc. We have written, you see, on Trinidad now. But at that time, there was no material, and anybody writing on that period had to rely on whatever was available in the writings. And what Naipaul wrote, you see, about Trinidad are, in the case of India, it is very clear. He came here. It is not a fiction. It was engagement with the society. But what he wrote, you see, about Trinidad, there are 4 books which are all fiction. So, but the fiction, you see, is based on what he observed. In fact, the Nobel Prize, as mentioned, a house for Mr. Biswas, that was semi-autobiographical. He made his father is Biswas there. He himself is Anand there. He poked fun of his grandmother and maternal uncles, etc. They all, of course, abused him for that. But that book is a very sensitive portrayal, you see, of the period. So you find he undergoes change. That is very inevitable. His method of writing undergoes change. An area of darkness and Million Mutinies, lot of difference.
Thank you, sir. Chandu? Yeah.
Quick question. I would actually try to be provocative
Last
and say there is no change. There is nothing that changes in his view. I think he's soft or hard, but he's a modernizer through and through. His Nobel lecture is titled Our Modern Civilization. He is unrepentantly a modernizer, which in itself isn't a problem, except that some of the claims then become erroneous. I mean, when he says untouchability, you mentioned that, comes to be seen as a problem only the Western idea of decency. Just empirically not the case. As we know, it's been a problem for centuries internally as a critique. Similarly, in this book, he says, we have not experienced the state, Indians have no sense of the contract, etc. This idea of a normal image of a state-society relationship is a European one. And it's obvious it can't be that. We have a different notion of political belonging, etc., etc. So I think these disputes, but be that as it may, I feel the fact that he was such a ardent modernizer, for bourgeois society, really, there's nothing more. I'm just wondering if you want to comment on that, because even the quality of the quest suffers as a result. Because if you start to understand India,
Uh,
it's happening on.
I would react to say
Yes.
on two. I would like to make two observations. One is this. These are, you see, to be observed. I am seeing sociology in it. He did not write it as a sociology. Therefore, I would not take him, you say, on a sociological critique of, you see, that. True. There are certain things, you say, which get exaggerated in his understanding. Definitely, no doubt about it. But the second point that you mentioned about the modernizer, you have to have a frame. But that frame that you are speaking of undergoes remarkable change in the last book, where he says Indians now are thinking about themselves. The borrowed, you see, thing, what all you mentioned, that ends more or less with the second book. In the third book, it is totally, you see, a different take. That is the remarkable change, you see, that I would say. And I would, since you showed some interest after that book, I think you should, you say, go into that. That's the best that I would say. Which one? I would reserve it, you see, to myself. I will not answer.
Maybe another lecture.
Another lecture.
Okay.
And that I get too provoked. So I keep it to myself.
Okay. Okay. Yeah,
I just presented as a reading of what it has. It is not an attempt at literary criticism or critique.
thank you very much, sir. I think we are almost end of the time. And then thank you very much for delivering this 14th Golden Jubilee lecture. As we are all ISECians, so we all value this Golden Jubilee year, and then it's the significance of that. And then you could come here and then give this lecture. But I think the formal Thanksgiving will be done by Diana, and then I will request her to do that honors.
Before she does that,
Yeah.
I would like to thank all of you for your. I would like to thank all of you for taking time out of your own engagements to come and listen to me, a person who is retired and
No, you are not retired. You are
Ah,
not retired.
who
Okay.
and
But
who is
otherwise a
talking
person-
who is
see-
talking about Naipaul, not sociology or any of the
So
sociological
your
issues.
newest book is the last week, sir. So what you are saying? You are not retired actually.
Okay,
Okay.
thank you. Even for those you see who are online, I see many familiar, some familiar faces and mostly familiar names. Now, over Gayatri is there, CB Damle is there, Chandrima is there. My wife is also watching, I think, first one, she is there, Mansi is there, and Singh Sodhi is there, Professor Indra is there, Gayatri Devi is there, yes, Indrajit Singh is there. So I see, I think some may not be seen there. So, thank you.
Good evening, all. As we successfully come to an end of the 14th Golden Jubilee Lecture, let me take the privilege to thank all those who have been a part of this. It is my honor to thank the respected speaker of the day, Professor N. Jayaram, former director and former member, Board of Governors, ISEC. I am sure everyone here would agree with me when I say it was enlightening and interesting to hear from you, sir, on the topic Understanding a Wounded Civilization, a sociological reading of V.S. Naipaul's Indian Trilogy. Thank you, sir, for this informative and interesting lecture. May I thank Professor Sukadev Thorat, Chairperson, Board of Governors, ISEC. We are deeply indebted to Professor Rajshekhar, Director, ISEC, for his valuable support and the welcome address. I also thank Dr. Channama Kambara, Assistant Professor Kruva, for introducing the speakers to us. We are much obliged to Dr. Saubin George for coordinating the lecture series. I also place a thanks to all the professors and the participants, both online and offline, to actively participating in the lecture. I wholeheartedly thanks all the faculty members, friends, academic session supportive staffs, and Mr. Satish Kamath sir for supporting and smooth functioning of the program. I hope this afternoon was enriching and rewarding to all of us. Thank you and have a nice evening.
Thank you, Diona, for this thing. Okay, let's all give a round of applause for Professor Jayaram. Thank you very much, sir. Yeah.